And the company, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, had decided to cut their wages for the third time in 3 months. And the city of Martinsburg, as did the cities of Baltimore, and we have a slide later of Pittsburgh, and the city of Buffalo and Harrisburg, a whole series of major railroad centers went up in insurrection and all later in flames. The entire railroad yards in Pittsburgh were completely destroyed. It was equivalent to a general strike, and virtually the entire city went out. And interestingly enough, the local National Guard, the local police all dropped their arms and joined in with the strikers. And the way that the United States federal government responded to that was first to send in federal troops in all of these situations, and then secondly to develop two sorts of institutions. They've started building what were called armories to provide small arms to the state National Guards and the federal troops. And also they began to develop systematically state National Guards. Up until that time, it had pretty much, policing had been taking place by police force and local militias, but it became logical to get people who weren't from Pittsburgh to try and put down the insurrections in Pittsburgh. In fact, in Pittsburgh, the insurrection was put down by local militia from Philadelphia, since there was always a rivalry between Philadelphia and
like bringing in the Cossacks.
It sort of brings to mind a quote from the period of Jay Gould claimed in the 1870s that he could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half.
Much in American labor history has been suppressed. But tonight we talk about the insurrection, strikes, even taking over whole cities, and the repression by the government.
Most of us here on Alternative Views and in the press find that we're interested in exposing cover-ups, everything from Watergate, Koreagate, Peanutgate, Burt Lands and his crowd. But tonight, we're going to deal with a different type of a cover-up. If you went to school and didn't learn who Bill Haywood was, Eugene Debs, Mother Jones, or Harry Sims, you were victimized by a cover-up. Tonight, we have with us the nephew of Harry Sims, who, like Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, 3 decades later, went into the South to organize people for the fight for human rights and dignity. Stuart Hirsch, welcome. Well, tonight, we're going to talk about Harry Sims and other heroes of the class war in America. But before we get to that, we'll have the news as usual.
It seems that the left wing has taken over control of the city council in Berkeley. And they say that the media there, of course, they're not a part of this, and they said that you got to watch out because the left majority in the city council is going to mean radical changes. And the new mayor said, well, if radical means serving the people, the low income, the disenfranchised, then there will be some radical change. So, what's this radical change? Among the first decisions that they've come up with are measures to strengthen rent control, condominium conversion prohibitions, so they can't kick people out of apartments and turn them into condominia. They took action on recycling, a new anti-eviction proposal, a plan for binding arbitration between Berkeley government employees of the city, the union workers there in the city, and an end to forced retirement from city service at the age of 70. And some other discrimination, any other discrimination on the basis of age. That doesn't sound too radical. It sounds rather reasonable and humane.
And a variety of different initiatives that are progressive were passed in the Berkeley, San Francisco area, so that the left there was feeling very good, whereas everywhere else in the country, the right was triumphant and ascendant.
Well, the CIA is after ABC. And what is curious about this is that the story that they're concerned about was published back several months ago by the right-wing newspaper, The Spotlight. But the CIA didn't say anything to it until ABC picked it up. What happened was this, apparently. A man named Ronald Rewald had a big investment company in Honolulu, and he was involved with some of the big names in Honolulu, Dillingham and Wong and some others. And what happened, apparently, was it was a CIA front, and they were doing all kinds of clandestine activities overseas, including gun running, plots to destabilize economies of various countries. Well, the Internal Revenue Service apparently didn't know about this, and they started investigating it. And when they started investigating it, everybody started running. The CIA pulled the plug on the money, and suddenly the investors in this, including Rewald, were left hanging dry. And so Rewald started saying, hey, this is the CIA operation. The CIA's got to compensate our investors. We can't be left like this. Well, then according to him, the CIA had tried to have him assassinated, tried to have him killed. Well, the ABC picked up this story, and immediately the CIA has counterattacked, denied it, and eventually the network backed down and said, well, we have no reason to doubt the CIA's denial on this, but the CIA is unappeased now. They're going to the FCC, try to get the ABC to do something under the Fairness Doctrine. And the FCC chief, Mark Fowler, who's an ardent foe of the Fairness Doctrine, suddenly he's saying, oh yes, yeah, well, Fairness Doctrine applies here. And he's agreed to hear the case at least. Well, the CIA spokeswoman, meanwhile, was contacted by The Guardian, and she explained that the agency went to the FCC because we didn't think it was fair to the American people to think the CIA was out there killing people.
They wouldn't do that.
Not the CIA.
That's right. I have an article from the Wall Street Journal that makes me believe that there's a lot that we have to learn from our European brethren. More so than in the U.S., labor unions in Europe lately have been working on getting shorter work weeks as opposed to more money from companies that seem to be cash-strapped at the moment. In some countries currently, such as in West Germany, they're working on a 35-hour work week, which is nice. But in Sweden, now they've blown off the 40-hour work week, and they've gone below the 30-hour work week. In fact, according to these figures, Swedes work about 1,500 hours a year, or an average of about 28.8 hours a week. That's what I call working. Bo Toresson, who's Secretary General of Sweden's governing Social Democratic Party, says, quote, "We all want shorter working hours, but in order to give us more family and leisure time, not necessarily because it leads to more jobs, although this does seem to be an offshoot of the program. In France, for instance, they found that cutting an hour off the work week led to maybe 30,000 more jobs and perhaps prevented an equal number of layoffs." That's not a bad idea. Maybe we should get started here on that. Well, whatever, Sweden does boast an admirably low unemployment rate of 2.9%. Can you remember the last time that our unemployment rate was 2.9%? Was it ever? Some of these people that are working are in jobs, of course, subsidized by the government, and private jobs paid for by public funds, or in training programs, or in temporary public sector jobs. And several other European countries complain that, well, they can't afford these things. But the Swedes counter that the rest of Europe is paying out almost as much in cash unemployment benefits, which don't foster new skills or they don't do anything useful for the public. Now, the combination of shorter hours and government measures in Sweden means that a higher percentage of adults have some sort of job there than anywhere else in the world. 80% of all adults there hold some sort of job. In the United States, it's only 66%. Now, a big reason why the working hours are more popular with Swedes than other Europeans, of course, is their 60% tax rate. As one person says, it just isn't worthwhile to work longer hours for cash. the unions are going for increased leisure instead of money, because the money is going to get taken away in tax anyway. You know, we have a pretty good tax system. Maybe we should consider the same sort of solution. Now, not all workers, of course, are working such low hours. You might expect that the factory workers, the industrial slugs, are the ones that are working your basic 40 hours a week. And that's true among men. Now, women, even women industrial workers, are only working 30 hours a week. So there is some discrepancy there that the women aren't very happy about. Now, they're interested in the Social Democrats pledge to smooth out these differences and have everybody work a 6 hour a day, 5-day week, which sounds pretty reasonable to me. Madge Lislew, a member of Parliament who's president of the National Federation of Social Democratic Women, says, and I quote, "We want a society where men and women share equally being the breadwinner and the housekeeper." Listen to this, I love this. "Everybody should be able to work a 6 hour day for a salary they can live on. Women can't live on their part-time salaries now." And I think this is just another way that the Europeans really are much more civilized than we are. I think it's about time for the 35-hour work week. What do you think?
The Swedes also have done a lot in kind of humanizing the production process. They've changed a lot of the procedures for, instead of this automated production line where you're just a robot, they've done it with teams and other ways to try to make it more human.
Live in the workplace a little bit.
And they've also given workers the ability to involve themselves in corporate decisions, to inspect the books, to play a role in the construction of policy and organization of the workplace. So they're probably the most advanced country.
They also give new fathers maternity leave.
Right. As a matter of fact, that's mentioned in the article that one of the ways they enforce the shorter work week is a mandatory 5-week vacation. That's real rough on the workers. 9-month maternity leave, which fathers can share, time off for study or political activity, and of course they have a high percentage of part-timers in the workforce. So those are also some contributing factors here.
That's pretty good.
The Reagan administration, again, wants to request money for the Contras to try to overthrow the Sandinista government, and are going back to Congress after the money was cut off for the Contras last year to try to get the money reinstated. And there was also an article in the New York Times that the Cubans, the right-wing Cubans here in the United States, are organizing, a guerrilla unit to send down to Central America to fight against the Sandinistas. And exile leader Huber Matos, who was previously an associate of Fidel Castro, who left Cuba, has come to the United States and is organizing a guerrilla unit of Cubans from the United States to go down there and fight against the Sandinistas, and is raising money to fund this project. And there's another article in the New York Times that indicates that the Detroit Free Press claims that United States helicopter units in 1982 and 1983 regularly flew combat missions in Nicaragua with U.S. troops aboard, and that 17 U.S. soldiers were actually killed during these operations. The Detroit Free Press said they had information from some of the members of the family of the dead soldiers who had told them that they were flying combat missions regularly in Nicaragua. The Pentagon, of course, denies this, but the Detroit Free Press holds to their story.
Isn't that interesting? Here's a typical way of manipulating the news and the story. This is a significant story.
Yeah.
Look where the New York Times has it. A little story about 5 inches, and it's buried down in the corner, and I don't know what page it is, but isn't that typical? That's a major story. And there's another one which was brought out in an article in The Nation magazine, in which it said that I believe it's a Providence, Rhode Island newspaper, indicated that the U.S. had bribed those right-wing politicians to boycott the Nicaragua elections. That once again is a major story, but
And it's just buried.
got the big play.
That was also mentioned in the press clip section of the Village Voice.
It was.
Several weeks ago, right. They were paying these officials money not to be involved, or they
Right.
wanted to. Several of them decided that they didn't want to go through with it.
And these stories rarely get on network television. The only place you find them is somewhere buried in the New York Times, or maybe in the Village Voice or The Nation,
Now,
or some left-wing presses.
if New York Times had prominently displayed that in page 1, then the networks would have picked it up, because the networks go along being wagged by the New York Times all the time.
There's another story that's also close to this. We've been reporting over the years about all the bombing of abortion clinics by different right-wing groups and individuals, in which over 20 were bombed last year. There were hardly any major reports in newspapers, wire services, or the networks until over Christmas they finally caught some of the bombers, some young yuppie right-wing Christians who admitted bombing some of these abortion clinics. And so finally the networks start covering this story, and also finally Ronald Reagan actually got down and condemned these abortion bombings, and then a little bit later I heard that Jerry Falwell also condemned them, whereas Reagan, Falwell, and these other people who regularly attack abortion hadn't whispered a word against these people who were bombing abortion clinics until the networks made this a big story, and finally Reagan and Falwell and some of these people were forced to condemn these bombings.
Well, let's find out what the workers have been doing all these years.
Well,
besides taking their lumps.
that's it, exactly. As the son of a truck driver, this show is especially...
We're doing roots now?
No, that's exactly what's going on. Since the 1960s, students discovered that they weren't the only people in revolt, that there's a rich heritage of resistance on the part of workers, and they needed to do some of their own roots. And the books arrayed in front of us on the table is testimony to the growing literature on a people's resistance. In a country where the word anarchy, which literally in Greek means anarchy, means without rulers, it's important to be able to convince people that they are incompetent, that they lack the means of self-government and wisdom to run their own lives. And to do that, you need to rob their own history, a history of resistance and a history of struggle. Today, in some modest way here on Alternative Views, we're going to try to reclaim some of that legacy of resistance. And we have with us one of Austin's best labor historians, Stuart Hirsch, who's going to discuss labor history. Stuart, welcome.
Thank you. What I want to talk about today is some instances of struggle that I think most people aren't familiar with. I certainly wasn't familiar with them until I began looking at labor history about 4 or 5 years ago. And what I want to mention at the outset is that in 1976, the United States celebrated its bicentennial, and for about a year prior to July 4th of 1976, we had bicentennial minutes. And in those bicentennial minutes, they told us about cooking in New England during the Revolutionary War, and they told us about, you know, what George Washington was wearing to the ball in New York City. Various extremely significant historical.
Michelle spending those millions to bring us these little tidbits right after the energy crisis.
Right. Very good point. In 1977, we did not get the centennial minutes of the anniversary of what has been described by historians of all stripe as the Great Upheaval. The most violent year in American history was 1877, and the entire year passed without a notice of this. So I wanted to call to the attention of people what exactly went on in 1877 and what went on in years subsequent to that in the United States, so that everyone can get a little more familiar with the fact that a lot of people have attempted to resist cuts in their lifestyle, have attempted to better their working conditions, both for themselves and for the generations to come. And sometimes people have succeeded, sometimes people have failed, but as the saying goes, we never got handed anything on a silver platter, and we had to fight for whatever we were able to get. And sometimes that was a lot, and sometimes it ended up meaning that people had to die and there wasn't much success at all.
Stuart, I want to intervene here. It strikes me as rather ironic that you, the nephew of a organizer who was killed in the 1930s, had to wait until he was in his mid-20s to find out about labor's untold story. How do you explain that?
Well, I think there's you know, among people who had knowledge of what went on in this country even in the 1930s and 1940s, and during the McCarthy period, during the 1950s, people who had been active in unions, people who had been active politically in the 30s in various sorts of causes were very anxious to suppress any memory of their own personal activity for fear that it could result in loss of their job or the end of their career, depending on what profession or occupation they had pursued. And I think that in the 1960s that memory remained still very faint as American students in particular looked overseas for heroes and started talking about the heroes such as Che Guevara and Ho Chi Minh and various people involved in the anti-war movement or the civil rights movement looked overseas for their heroes. And I think that that until a new group of historians in the last 10 to 15 years really began looking at labor history, there wasn't much of an opportunity to capture the history that even existed, and there was a tendency on the part of people who had been actively involved to not talk about it. I think that that's changed quite dramatically now, and that people are more open in talking about the activity that they engaged in, and we're beginning to recapture some of the history we had lost.
One thing I'm sure, though, that if we were to go into a grammar school today, the history being taught would still be the history of industrialists, the history of generals, the history of presidents. It would not be the history of working people struggling for dignity.
Yeah, and it's not even the history of rebellion. I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, which was the location of where Shays' Rebellion occurred in the 1700s, and we never learned about Shays' Rebellion, and all of the high schools were within a mile of where Shays' Rebellion occurred, and until I came to Texas and found out what Shays' Rebellion was, I wasn't even aware it occurred in my own hometown. And I'll give you some idea of how history
well, let's go to your
distorted.
Let's go to your visuals. You've got some good ones, I know.
Okay, in the 1840s, the United States really began developing industrially, and many of the early factory workers were women. We had very properly dressed women who were working in the textile mills of New England going out on strike in the 1840s. And most people don't know that women were the backbone of the factory system almost from the outset, and that not only were women the backbone, but they were very militant as well. We have some other pictures of other individuals who are the backbone of the industrial system. Here's pictures of slaves in the American South. One of the points I would like to make is that, you know, this country was not built exclusively by white men. Women were a very integral part of the labor force, both at home and outside of the home. Blacks in a non-wage situation were very important in developing the agricultural resources of the United States, both during slavery when they weren't paid and after slavery when they were virtually maintained in slavery.
As Richard Pryor would say, you're free now, brother, just pick the cotton.
Right, right. But by the Civil War era, railroads were becoming an important part of the American economy. It wasn't just the emergent factories or the developing agricultural system, but railroads were a very important part. It was the railroads that really made this a nation, insofar as railroads were the link between the West Coast and the East Coast and the South, and our whole industrial system developed as a result of railroads. And it's not surprising that in 1877 the railroads became the location of the greatest year of violence in American history. On July 16, 1877, some strikers were to be found at Martinsburg, West Virginia. They were very upset about the fact that they had just suffered through a 3.5-year depression, and the company, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, had decided to cut their wages for the third time in 3 months. And the city of Martinsburg, as did the cities of Baltimore, and we have a slide later of Pittsburgh, and the city of Buffalo and Harrisburg, a whole series of major railroad centers went up in insurrection and all later in flames.
Are these drawings?
Some of these are drawings and some of these are photographs. I think that's a sketch of Pittsburgh burning in 1877.
How extensive was the damage?
The entire railroad yards in Pittsburgh were completely destroyed. It was equivalent to a general strike, and virtually the entire city went out. And interestingly enough, the local National Guard, the local police all dropped their arms and joined in with the strikers.
Similar to what happened in Iran.
Similar to what happened in Iran. And the way that the United States federal government responded to that was first to send in federal troops in all of these situations. And then secondly, to develop two sorts of institutions. They've started building what were called armories to provide small arms to the state National Guards and the federal troops. And also they began to develop systematically state National Guards. Up until that time, it had pretty much, policing had been taking place by police force and local militias, but it became logical to get people who weren't from Pittsburgh to try and put down the insurrections in Pittsburgh. In fact, in Pittsburgh, the insurrection was put down by local militia from Philadelphia, since there was always a rivalry between Philadelphia and
like bringing in the Cossacks, right?
Right, like bringing in the Cossacks.
So then when people go to roller derby today in the cities of the Northeast and the armories, it's really ironic. It's a strong commentary that we've been robbed of our history, that they don't know what the origin of those armories are.
It sort of brings to mind a quote from the period of Jay Gould claimed in the 1870s that he could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half.
He was the railroad magnate.
He was the railroad magnate, and he, interestingly enough, should have mentioned that the reason he could do that was because wages were so low. Now he would have to have a more capital-intensive sort of repression system. And
he would also play ethnic rivalries. He played one ethnic group off another.
Right.
Stuart, what about the Pinkertons? Weren't they involved at this point, or did they come in later?
The Pinkertons were involved as early as the late 1860s, early 1870s. They were a very essential part in putting down a mine workers organization in Pennsylvania called the Molly Maguires, and Allen Pinkerton hired the man who later was able to develop the trumped-up case against the miners. And the Pinkertons continued to surface throughout labor history, and if we get an opportunity this evening, we can talk about that. But
I understand at one time the Pinkertons outnumbered the U.S. Army something like 3-1.
No, that's very possible. That's very possible.
And we still have the Pinkertons today, right? They're driving around their little cars.
Sure.
In other words, the capitalists had their own private armies.
Right. Before the advent of the national of a standing national army, the capitalists had to go out and hire their own thugs to do their work. Now they're able to have the costs socialized, and when the working people get out of hand, they're able to call in somebody at taxpayers' expense to put down the strikes. It's much more cost-effective.
Workers pay for their own control.
Right.
What's next?
We have some more slides we'd like to show you. These are front page of the New York Times from that era. Pictures of fires and destroyed railroad yards during this era. All of these slides are from the late 1800s, early 1900s. This slide will depict the condition of, again, women working in the sweatshops, whereas they were pretty much at the boss's mercy. They were usually not organized, or if they did organize, the ringleaders of their union were often fired, and conditions were pretty bad.
You said the New York Times before. It's good to mention that the press, if you think the press is anti-labor today, you really ought to read some labor history, because the words that were used were in terms of exterminate the masses, exterminate this ethnic mongrel hordes from Europe that are polluting the American system. The press were just totally on the side of business at the time.
Okay, and again, here are some more pictures of the intimidation that took place in the factories. These are more pictures of the insurrection.
1877.
1877. This is perhaps one of labor's most famous graphics. This is 1886. In 1886, there was an organization known as the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor, along with other labor organizations, decided that there would be a rally on May 1st, known as May Day, to celebrate, hopefully, the winning of the 8-hour day for all workers. As we know in United States history, some people today still don't have an 8-hour workday.
They were working what back then, 12, 16 hours?
They were,
14.
Some were working 14, 16 hours in the mine industry. They had what was known as the double shift. Was it in steel?
Steel.
Okay. They
Until
had
1919, the strike.
Right. They had what was known as the double shift, whereas you worked 12 hours a day every day, and then you had the privilege every other week of having one Sunday off. However, the alternate week that you didn't have the Sunday off, you worked a consecutive 24-hour shift, because your noon to midnight shift happened to coincide with your midnight to noon shift the next week. And so to have one day off every 2 weeks, you were, for that privilege, you had to work 24 hours.
And one of the most hazardous of all of occupations, steel industry, along with mining, probably the worst.
Right. Okay, this picture depicts what really was the beginning of the fight for the 8-hour day. Now, the 10-hour day for federal employees had been won back under Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, but it was a long time. It was really the 1930s before an 8-hour day really became fairly commonplace for most American workers. And as I say, today, not all American workers are able to work only 8 hours a day.
What are the circumstances? What does this visual depict here?
Okay, on May 1st, there was a strike in Chicago, and there was a lockout in Chicago at one of the local factories. And there was a protest of this lockout. Now, a lockout is when the company anticipates a strike and closes its gates so none of the workers can come in and seize the factory. And so what occurred on May 1st was the company locked out the workers. The workers weren't expecting it, and they rallied again on May 3rd outside the company gates to protest the fact that they couldn't get into the company to work. During the period of this confrontation between the workers and company officials, 3 workers were shot, and a rally was called for May 4th in Chicago. This is still in 1886. The rally was held at Haymarket Square, and everything was very peaceful. The rally went on for a number of hours. The mayor showed up, the chief of police showed up to make sure that the strike didn't get out of hand. It's not clear at this point what exactly occurred, but a bomb went off. It's not clear who set it, but what happened as a result of that was that 7 anarchists in Chicago, none of whom were present at the rally or had any connection with the events that were occurring that day, none of them that were physically present at the rally at the time that the explosion occurred, were all arrested. And some of the subsequent photos will show some scenes of the trial and of the general events around Haymarket. Here are some of the workers who died at Haymarket. There were police and workers killed. The 7 people who were indicted were all brought to trial. One of the 7, interestingly, was a man named Albert Parsons, who was a lifelong resident of Austin, and he was a reader. He used to read the legislation at the Texas legislature during the Reconstruction period.
Which one is he here, do you know?
I'm not really sure. But Albert Parsons was put on trial along with his 6 fellow anarchists, and the anarchists were all convicted. 4 of them all of them were sentenced to death. One of them committed suicide. 2 of them were later released after 20-year sentences, and 4 of them were hanged, although there was no connection ever made between their presence at Haymarket and the bombing that occurred. It was just a clear lynch job. Here's a picture of us in 1902 in the Pennsylvania minefields.
It sounds like these occurred about every 10 years.
Major strikes were occurring almost every year.
Oh, I see.
Okay. If it wasn't in the railroads, it was. There were all kinds.
The Great Homestead Strike of 1892, Andrew Carnegie's Steel Works. That's probably one of the most momentous events in labor history. And then 1894, the general strike, called the Pullman Strike in Chicago, led by Eugene Debs and the American Railway Union. That's where they shut down Chicago itself, and Jebs was put in jail. And then you have throughout the West, the Wild West, not being just cowboys and Indians, but in Colorado and Idaho, Coeur d'Alene and Cripple Creek, etc. The miners there, the both tin and silver miners, were very militant, and some of the boldest pages of labor history are in the West. So when we jump to 1892, when we jump to 1902, we're not saying that the 1890s were the gay 90s. They were tough times, but the workers fought back.
Yeah.
Okay, we'd like to show you some more slides. Generally, what we'd like to depict are some of the working conditions. This is the result of the explosion at Monondaga in Pennsylvania. I believe 102 miners were killed in this mine explosion. This was in 1902. And what we'd like to present is the fact that children were very much the backbone of the workforce at this time, because
How young?
the theory went as young as 6. There's no indication that anyone was employed before then, but I think what we find is that the children, it was assumed, could not work as hard as adults could. And so it was often to the advantage of businessmen to hire children and work them as hard as they could.
There's also to be entered here is the fact that the children and women were used as part of the means to break the craft control over production. Until that time, before the introduction of capital-intensive machinery, the crafts had control of the production process. But with the introduction of machinery, children and women could be put in its place and break the control of craft unions.
Right, and children were found in all industries. Here's a picture of children involved in glass factories. They were found in textiles. They were involved in mining. They were just totally pervasive throughout the economy. And the child labor laws, which labor fought very hard in order to get, labor thought it had achieved success on child labor in the 19-teens. Supreme Court ruled child labor laws unconstitutional.
Yeah.
It wasn't really until the 1930s that labor was actually able to limit the participation of children in what were obviously hazardous industries. There's various sorts of industries, and
well, they still work in the fields today.
Right, and we have some pictures of that.
That's a great picture there.
Oh, isn't that hideous?
The children in coal, in particular, had the task of sorting out the larger hunks of coal from the smaller hunks of coal. If you ever see the movie The Molly Maguires, which generally is not very accurate historically, it does depict, I think, at various points, the role of children in the mining industry, their role was to pick out the smaller pieces from the...
Which was one of the most unhealthiest jobs, too.
Right. And there's a picture of a child working in the fields. I believe that's cotton. And tobacco. In Massachusetts today, in the cigar tobacco fields, the primary age of the workforce is 13 and 14 years old, and the tobacco is usually harvested in the summer by people who I went to junior high school with, at that age group. Agriculture, it still employs a lot of children.
Well, that's one reason why we still have our 9 months of school, so the kids could be let out during the summer to do the harvest.
Right, even before they reach the age of 16.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And as you can see, when you've worked all night in the factory, school does not make a great motivator. It doesn't even if you don't work all night in the factories usually. It's kind of an irony of American history. I'd like to just kind of run through some of these slides and show you that there were children in the streets.
That's a demonstration of some type there, and there were children.
That's a demonstration of Russian-born laborers in the streets of New York. And there were children involved often. When you see pictures of rallies, you see pictures of children. What I'd like to turn to is one strike that I think is particularly significant here in Texas, and that is a strike known as the Great Cowboy Strike of 1883. In 1883, the whole cattle industry was undergoing a great transformation, and all of the cattle companies in the Panhandle had been taken over by English and Scottish financial interests. There were virtually no native-owned cattle companies in the Panhandle by the mid-1880s.
Nowadays, we're selling the land to the Arabs and other people.
There was appropriation from England and Scotland. And on March 23rd, 1883, 325 cowboys went out on strike. They were at that time being paid $1.18 a day. They were working a 105-hour week, which is 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. And they were not paid for any time they lost due to illness or, due to their inability to be on the job. After the strike, they got their daily wage raised 50 cents from $1.18 to $1.68 a day. They got paid for their lost time, and they were able to not only achieve a better wage for themselves and slightly better working conditions, but they were able to ensure that the cooks also got paid at the same rate that the cowboys did. The cowboys were not just selfishly going out on strike, but were also looking out for the other people who were a very integral part of the trail drive. It's interesting to note that this strike occurs, as do many others in labor history, when small owners begin to be replaced by faceless managers who manage the companies owned by someone totally outside the city or town that the company's operating in. And that this sort of represents, in some sense, a dying of the West, because by the mid-1880s, it was impossible for small cattle companies to survive because the barbed wire had been introduced, and it was impossible to drive your cattle across great stretches of unwired land. It became necessary almost to own a huge amount of territory in order to be able to have your cattle graze and everything. Just one sort of sidelight of this whole development is the fact that some of the cowboys drove some of the managers out of the state of Texas and drove them to New Mexico, and then set up what was known as the Get Even Cattle Company, which was sort of composed of the cattle that had previously belonged to the people who had been driven all the way to New Mexico. So there was some period in Texas history when people felt that something this should belong to Texans and not to people outside, and effectively struck and were able to...
Well, actually, Texas history is not quite as docile as a lot of people would have you believe. You've got some things to say about the role of the IWW here in Texas,
right? The
Socialist Party.
Right. The lumber industry in East Texas was organized by the industrial workers of the world at the turn of the century. It was the only example that I can find in Texas of integrated unionism, where black and white workers were both allowed into the unions. The way that business interests in East Texas solved that was to jail the black strikers and to replace them by white scabs in this situation. There were approximately somewhere between 60 and 100 socialist newspapers in Texas at the turn of the century. And there were a whole series of populist uprisings and insurgencies throughout the state of Texas.
Even in the early vagrancy laws were really concocted to keep labor organizers off the streets.
Right. So you have a whole history here in the state of Texas, as well as in other parts of the country, that we're basically kept ignorant of. And I understand Frank is going to try and update some of that current history before we leave tonight.
Oh, I just have some information here about some of the strikes that are going on. You get a little bit of this in the media, but not a heck of a lot. Particularly, you don't get it from the workers' point of view, generally. There were some 3,100 lettuce workers on strike in California's Imperial Valley. There was another strike, which we reported to you about, coming to a successful conclusion as far as the farm workers in Florida are concerned. They won a 33% raise. The growers agreed to pay 40 cents for every 32-pound bucket of tomatoes picked. But, however, the growers weren't so naive. Well, maybe the workers were more naive than the growers were, but what the growers did, they substituted new buckets which held as much as 10 pounds more tomatoes, effectively wiping out the 10-cent an hour raise. So the workers are going back out on strike again. there is information about strikers all the time that never gets into the media. For there's a big one, a very significant one, going on in against Tenneco in the Newport News shipyard. The workers are going out on strike, particularly the black workers, who make up 60% of the workforce, are really the backbone of this strike. And if they're successful in Virginia against Tenneco, which is historically a great union-busting company, and in Virginia, which is a right-to-work state, this means that the labor movement in Virginia will get a big shot in the arm. Let's see, we have about 5 minutes, Stuart. Were you going to talk about the Seattle strike? To me, that's one of the most exciting periods in labor history where the...
Okay, I can talk about that real briefly. In 1919, there was a general strike in Seattle. And what we mean by that is that the entire workforce of Seattle stopped working in the sense that they no longer work for the companies that were in Seattle, but instead the workers themselves took over the essential running of Seattle. They ran free food kitchens for all of the residents of Seattle. They ran the hospitals. There was no need for hospital management during this period. They were very self-sufficient. And there was a general...
They directed the traffic?
They directed the traffic, just all of the social services.
Public transportation, everything.
Everything was completely controlled by the people who worked in Seattle.
One member of the National Guard was, a general in the National Guard was quoted as saying it was the most peaceful time he had seen in Seattle history when the workers had control of the city.
And so what we have is an example of people not needing either large businesses, small businesses, or the government running their services for them, but people actually being the government, people developing their own political structures, people developing their own institutions, and figuring out what needed to be done, what services were essential, what services were not essential, and ensuring that there was some way to raise the revenue and the resources to operate the essential services and to not operate the services that were not essential.
And I might add, the precipitating event to the Seattle general strike was the dock workers refusing to load the ships that were headed towards Russia for the counter-revolution in 1919. The United States at that time was conducting a secret war against the newly installed revolutionary government, and the dock workers refused to load the ships, and that was the precipitating event to so that kind of worldwide class consciousness, which we see so little of today, but it certainly was prominent then.
How long did they control Seattle before they...
I think Jack might...
They controlled for a good 5 days.
Only 5 days?
Yes, it was only 5 days. I know another chapter, just briefly, the Minneapolis general strike in 1934, the workers held the city for 7 days. Why they gave it back? Well, it's the armed force of the state. They didn't give it up because they wanted to.
Well, that shows that anarchy can work. I guess that's the essence of anarchy, right? People organizing themselves in the various structures to provide services?
Well, it's certainly a word that has been polluted by the mass media and academics today, is to not understand what the roots of anarchy is. It's the belief in a non-hierarchical society and that you do not need not only big business but big government to run your life.
Yeah, there is something which I think we should very much stress in the remaining few minutes, and that is that perhaps today laborers are really perhaps under the greatest threat ever, if for no other reason than safety. The conditions were horrible back in the days which you talked about, but now workers have to put up with asbestos, inhaling asbestos, and cotton dust, and brown lung, and black lung, and working in plants that produce PCV and all kinds of chemicals that where workers get sick and die from and get cancer, tritium, uranium poisoning. We saw what happened in the cyanamide plant where they were requiring women to be sterilized. These are, some of the most pernicious things that ever happen. We seem to think that just because workers are making more money than they used to and driving more cars, that things are really good, but it's insidious to me that what is going on.
Well, we saw what happened in West Virginia last summer when the construction workers were forced to go up at the electric production plant before the concrete was allowed to sit on the scaffolding, and the scaffolding collapsed in the town of I think it was St. Mary or West Mary, West Virginia. Just tens.
Well, workers are often blackmailed. They're blackballed by the fact that corporations hold a leverage over communities, small communities, and that they're asked to make a choice between life and livelihood.
I see we have time for 2 more news stories.
There's a report in these times that this past summer, the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee opened a secret investigation into the Iran-Contra affair, examining what different federal agencies knew about the scandal and when they knew it. In 4 recent columns, Stuart Harris, who's an associate of Jack Anderson, reports that the Senate committee was told by a former CIA desk officer that the agency knew in September of 1985 of the shipment of U.S. TOW anti-tank missiles to Iran days after the missiles arrived there. Bruce Hemings, who was a 17-year CIA veteran who in 1985 was assigned to the Iran desk, told the committee that an FBI agent, Randall Boone, called in late September to tell him that the FBI had discovered that the missiles had been illegally shipped to Iran. Well, this is interesting because it puts in question, or it contradicts rather, the actual testimony in the Senate Iran-Contra hearings concerning when the FBI and the CIA knew about the shipments of the illegal arms sales to Iran. The testimony in the Iran-Contra hearings indicated that it wasn't until November of 1985, 2 months before the CIA and the FBI actually knew, that William Casey and Robert McFarlane claimed that the CIA was finally informed of these shipments. What this report doesn't indicate, however, is the fact that it's very possible that the CIA was actually involved in this much earlier. Not only did they know about these shipments, but they actually facilitated the shipments themselves. But it's interesting how story after story breaks later that puts in question the official version of the Iran-Contra story that came out when it first broke, most of which was to protect Ronald Reagan from any involvement in this, as well as George Bush, who of course later became president. Frank, a Boston-based group called InFact is carrying out a boycott of all General Electric products because GE is one of the biggest producers of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, and because the weapons and energy that they've been producing has created a trail of radioactive and toxic waste. It's one of the biggest military contractors and one of the biggest nuclear polluters in this country. So the motto of GE is bringing good things to life, and the InFact group documents over the years all of the weapons and nuclear products that have been produced by GE. One of the things that they're particularly focusing on are light bulbs. So if you have any GE light bulbs, pull them out immediately and buy other light bulbs. In 1987, according to InFact, there was a $1.5 billion consumer light bulb market in the United States, and GE held 50% of that market. They had a near monopoly on light bulb productions, and some stores like Safeway carried only GE light bulbs, and so again, this monopoly of GE in the light bulb area was supported by Safeway and other stores. Well, this InFact group has forced Safeway to carry other light bulbs than GE ones, and has even gotten many different stores to stop carrying GE light bulbs altogether. They cite the Wheatsville Co-op in Austin, Texas, as one of the first places to ban GE light bulbs. So if you want to participate in this boycott against General Electric, which is one of the biggest nuclear producers, you can stop buying GE refrigerators and other appliances, GE light bulbs, and you might also boycott NBC, which is the network which in the last several years General Electric took over. Needless to say, NBC is the network that has the least news and documentaries critical of nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and has indeed had several positive programs on nuclear energy as a still viable energy option for the United States, a position that, of course, anti-nuclear activists are completely against.
Well, the labor statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics indicate that there are actually 8,000 on-the-job deaths last year, but some 10 million injuries and illnesses, occupational injuries and illnesses, were recorded last year. And some people say that probably about 100,000 actual job-related deaths occur, a very conservative thing. And that brings up to the bedtime story that we have here. The story comes from Militant Magazine, and there's a picture of the Bethlehem Steelworks. Slaughter at the Point is the name of the story. And when we talk about safety, we should think about individuals. Robert Carter, Robert Hall, Dunlop Johnson. Never heard of them before. But their stories tell the very grisly truth of the working conditions of the steel industry. Robert Carter was working in a blast furnace, which was one of 3 that was built back in the 1880s, although they'd been supposedly updated 19 years ago. Bethlehem had paid weekly fines to operate these 3 furnaces, which did not meet the pollution standards. They leaked poison gases constantly. Well, 3 weeks after starting work, Carter was killed, overcome by carbon monoxide gas. July 78, the hottest day of the summer, Dunlop Johnson died from heat stroke. He was working in the open heart furnaces where steel is made. Steel melts at 2,600 degrees, and it was 101 outside. Another worker has severe brain damage and still is in a coma. In June 78, Robert Hall died while working in a wire rope mill. He ran a high-speed wire drawing machine, and the machine didn't have any safety guards. The speeding wire caught Hall's hand and dragged him head first into the giant wire spool. 1970, the Occupational Safety Hazard Administration, OSHA, had cited Bethlehem Steel for neglecting safety such as this. They fined them $27,200, and when Dunlop Johnson died, they upped it another $7,000. So this is something to remember when people talk about getting the government out of business and OSHA coming in and telling business what to do. We might remember Robert Carter, Robert Hall, and Dunlop Johnson. Good night.
Come and listen to my story, come and listen to my song. I will tell you of a hero who's now dead and gone. I will tell you of a young boy whose age was 19. He was the bravest Union man that I have ever seen. Was a pal of mine, we labored side by side, expecting to be shot on sight or taken for a ride by them dirty coal operator gun thugs who roam from town to town, shooting down the Union men wherever they may be found. Sims was walking down the track one bright sunshiny day. He was a youth of courage, his steps was light and gay. He did not know the gun thugs was hiding on the way to kill our brave young comrade this bright sunshiny day. Sims was killed on Rush Creek in 1932. He organized the miners into the NMU. He gave his life in struggle, that was all that he could do.